Mary Elizabeth Halper. I'm Dean of the Humanities at Hertog Program. And in this conversation, I am joined by Dr. Christopher Utter from the American University, where he's a professorial lecturer in the Department of Government. There he teaches courses on the history of political philosophy, American political thought, American politics, and public affairs. And his research focuses mainly on questions of theory and practice in classical political philosophy. But today we're talking about a poem by W.H. Auden called The Shield of Achilles. And the reason we decided to talk about this poem came out of a class that I recently concluded with the Hertog Foundation and the Humanities at Hertog program on Emily Wilson's translation of Homer's Iliad. Now, this poem, The Shield of Achilles, of course, was written millennia after Homer's epic, and it is indeed much shorter. In fact, short enough that I will read it for you before we start our conversation. So here it is, The Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas. But there, on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat, and nowhere to sit down. Yet, congregated on its blankness, stood an unintelligible multitude. A million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones as dry and level as the place. No one was cheered, and nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else, to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower garland and heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there, on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed an arbitrary spot where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and centuries sweated, for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary, decent folk watched from without, and neither moved nor spoke, as three pale figures were led forth and bound to 3 posts driven upright in the ground. Mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs quick to music. But there on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that 2 boys knife a third, were axioms to him who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armorer Hephaestus hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. I hope you enjoy our conversation on this beautiful, chilling, challenging poem. All right, excellent. Well, thank you all for being here to talk about this poem, The Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Before we jump in, I'd like to make sure that everyone introduces themselves. I've I've had the privilege of getting to know you in our conversations about the Iliad so far, but Chris Utter here is meeting you for the first time. So let's start with, we'll go alphabetically. Jacob, would you start us off?
Of course. So I'm Jacob Foster. I'm one of the three people here who was recently a participant in the Her Talk Iliad seminar, which was exciting and thrilling, and longtime fan of the Iliad. Currently, I'm a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and I'm stationed here at Fort Moore. And I graduated this past year from West Point.
Hi, I am Francis. I am also a recent alumna from the Iliad seminar. I go to Austin College. I'm a junior. I'm studying classical archaeology and history, and I've been speaking Latin and Greek for Latin for 15 years and then Greek for 4.
All right, great, excellent. And we're joined here today with Chris Utter, who is a professor at American University, and he is going to talk about this poem with us. And I was thinking that I'd like to start with a question about, I guess, about sort of the structure of the thing, and in particular, there's one moment that I would just really love to understand better. So we get these sort of interspersed between a Thetis looking over Hephaestus's shoulder at what is happening on the shield. We get sort of three moments. One very clearly in a war, or just about to go. Yeah, a war is right on the horizon. A million eyes, a million boots in line. And then there's a second one where there's an execution. It seems unclear exactly what the situation is. And then the last one, there's a ragged urchin who's just trying to kill birds. And that last, I mean, some of the most beautiful lines and heart-wrenching lines about the world of this urchin is, he's never heard of a world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. But the world comes up earlier in the 6th stanza, and I think I'm actually really interested in what's the world of this poem. So I'm looking at the first lines of the 6th stanza. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. What's the mass and majesty of this world? Mm-hmm. Are we in a particular world? And if so, why? How does it always weigh the same? Or is there just one world for us human beings? Or is this fundamentally, there's been some sort of change in the world that this poem is sort of describing? That's where I'd like to start.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It does seem, on the one hand, like Auden is describing, is really kind of juxtaposing a very modern seeming world of modern warfare and its repercussions, right, with the ragged urchin, to the world of the actual shield of Achilles, right? So as though he's setting up the modern world versus the ancient world. But yeah, the way this line runs, or these first three lines of the 6th stanza, as you just mentioned, seems to suggest that it's somehow the same world, or at least it's possible. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. And I mean, there are several things that struck me about this. So this stanza 6 seems to be in response to what's going on in the 5th stanza, where we have this barbed wire, basically sounds like a prison camp, and three pale figures are being executed, presumably, after being attached to posts. This has got to be an allusion to Christ, to the crucifixion. It seems like there are these three figures. So that also suggests that there's something more than merely modern going on here, especially because he says, too, that the Thetis expects in stanza 4, expects there to be an altar, but instead there's another scene, which is this scene of a prison camp with the three figures being presumably executed. So yeah, I don't know. It does seem like maybe where the hope lies, if there if there is any hope in this, is that it is somehow the same world. But I really don't know what to do with the mass and majesty that always weighs the same. I don't know what the same weight is. Did you have a thought about that?
Yeah, so I was wondering if as I think you have to wonder, given the title of the poem and the way that these differently formed stanzas are interspersed, the stanzas where Thetis is looking and saying what she expects versus what she actually sees. At first, I thought, I wonder if there's a critique of the shield of Achilles that's in the Iliad, where there seems to be human life just sort of happening alongside a war. There's armies lined up on the shield, but there's also a scene of kind of a judicial dispute working itself out. There's the scenes that she mentioned here, like there's libations and sort of a festival happening. There's also dancing and merrymaking. So I wonder if the critique is something like, no, war doesn't get to just coexist alongside. That's a lie, shield of Achilles from Homer, right? There's not that compatibility that can be encompassed in the whole shield. But now I'm wondering about whether it's not saying that that's a lie, but it's saying it's more, they're not episodic. They actually inform each other, that they are all part of one world. The way you conduct justice, or the way that your children are, you're the youngest of your citizens live on the streets, or the way that you conduct war, it's all connected. And there's no like partitioning off human life. It is all gonna fit together. But then, yeah, so that helps me with the world weighing the same. But I think I still have this question about sort of what actually has happened to this world, these horrific images. Was it the war first? Was there a new way of conducting war that has had this diffuse effect? Or is this all happening at the same time, and it's just human beings that have become worse somehow? Yeah, well, I'm sure there. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like it's perfectly possible to read this as a kind of critique of Homer. I guess the one thing that I go back to, just thinking of Homer's depiction of the shield of Achilles, is it's, as you mentioned, right, it's not purely peaceful. And it seems like Thetis's, well, it seems like Thetis's expectations here are the three expectations appear to be peaceful, although I think they're not necessarily. The well-governed cities, right? If you look at the actual text, what's going on there is I think in the first city, it's well-governed because a murder has taken place, and there's adjudication going on as to how to deal with the murder. In the second case, it is a city at war that looks a lot like Troy, and I think throughout the shield depiction in the Iliad, there is this kind of undercurrent of violence. So I'm not to say that it's a balance. It's just that it's not entirely peaceful. But it does seem like what I'm struck by with the shield itself is how much of a world it is, like a single thing. And the last part that Hephaestus makes in Homer's depiction is ocean, encompassing the whole thing, sort of tying it all together. And you don't get that here. It seems like in this stanza that we've been looking at, in number 6, there is a world, this world, but it seems like in other parts of the poem, there isn't really a world in the sense of a whole. So, for example, you have in stanza 2 an unintelligible multitude. So somehow the multitude here, which sounds like because there are a million eyes, a million boots in line, so you have 500,000 people, I guess, right? 2 eyes, 2 feet. They're unintelligible. So there's no horizon within which they make sense. That seems to be gone. And then there's these boots that are marching. They're given some reason to march through statistics, right? But no one is cheered by this, and nothing was discussed. So there's just this sort of kind of scientific fiat. There's no actual discussion. So yeah, it seems like the world that he's depicting isn't really a world anymore, insofar as there isn't a hole in the way that there is in Homer.
Well, I think, that's a good, I really like that. There's not a hole there. We don't have anything like a wrapping up of the river of Oceanus around everything. But I really love that you brought us to this unintelligible multitude, because the multitude is intelligible in Homer. We get the catalog of ships. The people who die are named. A little bit of something is told about them. And so I think, I think both that there's no whole, but there's also no parts as parts. It's an sort of undifferentiated mass, it seems. And I wonder, the mass and majesty of this world. I don't see majesty in this world.
I know, exactly. Yeah.
But there's some really gory moments in the Iliad, but there are also moments, majesty seems the right word for it. There are moments of glory, of pathos, of real human connection. I mean, even on the battlefield itself. So, and I don't see anything like that here. So what's happened? I mean,
I know. Yeah, it it does seem like it has, or I wonder if it has something to do with these statistics. in stanza 3, right? He says, "Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just. In tones as dry and level as the place, no one was cheered and nothing was discussed. Column by column, in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief, whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief." And it sounds, the idea of a belief whose logic brings them somewhere else reminds me of something that probably not everyone here has read, but Hannah Arendt, in an essay, Ideology and Terror, talks about the logic of ideology as kind of this inexorable force that leads people in a certain direction. And it does seem like that might be what Auden is talking about here, that we have the attempt to render justice scientific, in the form of a kind of belief that you simply have to follow. I wonder if that's maybe what has changed, what has undone the meaning here.
Yeah, it's a strange way to come into this war. In the Homeric epic is a strange way to come into this war. It's already been going on. We kind of get the backstory of why it's happening, but as we see, there's lots of different reasons why different warriors are there fighting, and even the one that's sort of the most obvious or the most well cited one sort of doesn't go all the way to explaining why it's happening. There doesn't seem to be this kind of monolithic cause that was just. I mean, I think even the question of whether it's just for this to be happening is an open one, and a one that in some ways not a lot of people are actually concerned with in the Iliad. And so it's really strange. Now I have this I've got this juxtaposition of this world in which war can accommodate majesty, but not justice, like not questions of justice. Nobody's really worrying about whether this war is just or not. It's just happening and you have to deal with it. And then we have this other world here, the world of Auden's Shield of Achilles, where I can't find anything like beauty or dignity, but there is justice. I mean,
or at least some kind of justice, right?
Some kind of justice. I mean, it does seem, there's the cause that's just, and then where we started off in the 5th and 6th stanza, it does seem like it's an execution, right? So presumably there's at least the claim that this is violence rendered just by the state saying these people are guilty and deserve death. Enough that ordinary folk, right, ordinary decent folk, gathered to watch from without, and neither moved nor spoke. Yeah, so is there a particular kind of justice that's just not really fitting with a world in which there's dignity and majesty?
That's very interesting. Just thinking of the Iliad, of the causes of the war, it seems like, if I remember correctly, that there are sort of two causes. There's the judgment of Paris, and his being rewarded with Helen, etc. So that's kind of a question of justice, you could say. But then there's also isn't there the idea that the war is supposed to lift the burden of human beings off the earth. So there's this sort of I think it doesn't. Zeus owes this to his grandmother, something like that. There is an allusion to that too, if I remember correctly. But So in any event, it seems like the cause of the war is very much a sort of divine cause in either case, whereas here, and it's a divine cause that is somewhat that is fated and is understandable, at least insofar as it's part of what the gods do, right? The gods as having control over the human world as their puppets in a sense. But here, yes, we have somehow taken control of justice through statistics, but it's rendered the world meaningless. So we have this attempt to impose justice, maybe some understanding of justice, but we've instead of an altar, what this results in, instead of an altar to the gods, is a concentration camp, or something that seems to look a lot like it. And right, I'm not sure. It is a kind of irony, right? That is that the implication that in this sort of scientific pursuit of justice, we end up with a far less majestic and beautiful, we would have to say with the opposite of justice, at least by the end, right? By stanza 8, we have the result of this war is an urchin who thinks that of course girls are raped, and might makes right. Two boys knife a third, right? So there is no justice, at least in a recognizable way or form.
I think I'm thinking about the cause of justice that opens the Iliad. So not the war, but the poem about the war, about the city. And that's the claim that Achilles makes against Agamemnon, that he's done him. So it, like, not even between Greeks and Trojans, just between Greeks. And this, I think I'd really like to bring Jacob, because I need to get a question about Achilles, whom we actually haven't talked about at all, really, as a character, even though it is his shield. Although I always wonder with these, is it a subjective genitive or an objective genitive? Is it the shield that belongs to Achilles, or is it somehow a depiction of Achilles. But yeah, Jacob, you had a question about Achilles, who shows up in our last two lines of the poem here. Why don't you go ahead and take over a bit?
Yeah, so Chris, I was wondering, one of the things that stood out to me was kind of the fact that Achilles is really only mentioned and still kind of only alluded to at the end, but it's the title of the essay. And do you think that there is kind of any role of Achilles in the poem? Like, it's still invoking his reputation in a way. I think even outside his like specific role in the Iliad, Achilles has come to symbolize a lot of things, both whether it's the rage he's famous for, or just kind of a martial reputation. Is there any deliberate invoking of that, especially when the poem seems so intent on maybe the more faceless, unnamed masses that make up so much of war?
Yeah, I think it's got to be crucial. But I've been talking a lot, so I'll leave this question open to everyone else.
We get this nice sort of in the very last stanza, we get this nice sort of interpersonal set of relationships here, and something that has not been personal at all. So we have Thetis and her son. And we have Hephaestus, who has done this favor for her. It does seem like it shifts to the personal quite hard there at the end. Iron-hearted, manslaying Achilles. Iron-hearted. Did he seem iron-hearted in the Iliad, or is this a different Achilles here?
Well, he does seem to be. I mean, it's at least thinking of the first words of the Iliad, motivated by rage and a desire for revenge. I'm not sure if iron-hearted means ready to use iron, ready to go to war. It does, although I mean, wouldn't we say bronze? But no, I don't know. It depends what iron-hearted means, I guess. He at least is right, who would not live long. He doesn't live long and knows that he's not going to live long because he chooses to avenge Patroclus's death. So these things are connected, perhaps.
I mean, potentially from more of a biblical standpoint, often in the New Testament, whenever it's written that somebody's, in the Old Testament, that they harden their hearts, it doesn't necessarily mean apathy. It just means that they have committed themselves to being totally against a suggestion or a certain cause.
That does sound like Achilles, the Achilles that we met.
Yeah.
And I think, doesn't Patroclus say something like, you're an unnatural being. You were fathered by stones.
Yeah.
Because you're just unfeeling. But I think you're right, Francis. It's not just apathetic is not the right term. Not the right term for Achilles.
No.
But stubborn, I suppose.
I also think with Achilles, it really depends a lot on the vantage point from which you stand, right? Like Patroclus probably doesn't get a chance to really see Achilles at his most vulnerable and emotional, which is his response to the death of Patroclus, and which in a lot of ways he seems almost tenderhearted with his just, genuine affection for this person, his loss and his grief and all of that, in a way that you like really don't quite see the kind of same emotional weight attached to like, any other individual, even when he it's often more the idea of a war trophy rather than the actual person behind it. But at the same time, that also introduces him at arguably his most iron-hearted. If you were to ask any of the, young Trojans to be sacrificed at Patroclus's funeral, I imagine their view of Achilles may actually see him as much more iron-hearted than simply invoking the name may bring in the minds of most readers.
And there is, it does seem like Achilles is particularly ferocious, right? There is, as you just mentioned, Jacob, the his sacrificing 12 Trojans, right, at Patroclus's funeral. But there are other things too. Like I think he says at one point that he would like to eat Hector raw, if I remember correctly. So we have cannibalism and human sacrifice, and it does seem your question, Jacob, does raise the possibility that you raised, Mary Elizabeth, at the beginning of our conversation, that Auden is implying that really in Achilles' rage is sort of implied the horrors of war, even the horrors of specifically modern warfare, and something that Homer somehow glosses over, even if he does depict the blood and guts, right, of war in a way that's not depicted here, by the way, interestingly, in Auden's poem. But even with that depiction, there is a kind of obscuring of the meaninglessness, maybe, of war. Is that possibly why Auden reintroduces Achilles here? That even in Homer's world, war is somehow meaningless.
I sort of saw it in that light with that kind of question, but for me, I think that this reintroduction of Achilles in this more interpersonal stanza kind of positions Achilles as a juxtaposition to the soldiers that we see in stanza 3, because now we see war is obviously fought very different in modern times, even though it's the same thing. These men who are marching off, being inspired by statistics, they're not interacting with the people that they're killing. That's why they're not referred to as manslaying, but Achilles is, because Achilles is actually looking these people in the face while he's killing them.
Yeah, I was noticing they're really, I think the only act of violence in the whole poem is the attempt of the boy to hit the bird with the stone. Everything else is just alluded to. Like we don't actually see the execution, just really heavily implied. We see them marching off to war, but not actually committing any violence, just getting ready to. We hear that they come to grief, but I think the only thing, the only time we actually see a violent act in the description of the poem is this bird that flew up to safety from this ragged urchin's well-aimed stone. We hear that girls are raped, that 2 boys knife a third, were axioms. These are now axioms, but not actions that we see. And this last and like chilling line, who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. And that makes me think of book 24 of the Iliad. It makes me think of Priam and Achilles weeping side by side, not for each other. Achilles doesn't seem like he's sad that he killed Hector, but he's weeping because Priam is weeping in front of him. He's weeping over Patroclus. Priam is weeping over Hector. And it's this like co-weeping that allows them both to have this moment of expressed grief. So that does seem like it's possible in a world where you kill somebody with your hands. Then you can, But yeah, that's a tough thing to like almost want. I'm kind of amazed at myself for almost like, oh, I wish we could have fathers clinging to the knees, grasping the hands of the one who murdered all their sons, and have this like beautiful moment of crying. That's a weird thing to wish, but I wonder if that's what I'm brought to by this poem, is this strange affective situation.
And you do have throughout the poem a kind of separation of people. So you have, for example, the crowd of ordinary decent folk who watch from without and neither moved nor spoke. So watching an execution in a prisoner of war camp, perhaps something like that, but without crying out, without any sort of apparent sympathy for the people being killed. You then have in the next stanza, after the mass and majesty part, they were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. That somehow this, I think the they refers to the 3 figures, perhaps. I'm going to assume that. They were small. But this it seems to also be a reference to the small individuals, unnamed individuals in this mass that's described in stanza 2, the unintelligible multitude. And this also reminded me of Tocqueville's insight, right, about the kind of isolated individual as a result of equality of conditions, that there's something peculiarly modern about being small and individual and separated, and therefore somehow not able to have this sort of face-to-face connection with someone, maybe because you're killing him, right? But you are still seeing this person as Achilles, right? As this particular person, and not as one of a numberless mass. So yeah, I guess I am more persuaded by the idea that Achilles is brought in here at the end as a contrast to what Auden has been describing, rather than as Achilles himself as somehow being the cause of this description.
Francis, I think you had a question about hope, and I'm wondering if have we carved out a very strange, bloody, not entirely satisfying place for hope in this interpretation, do you think?
I'm still not sure, honestly. I've been reflecting on my question about that too. My question was that, obviously in the poem there seems to be this really remarkable absence of hope, and it seems as though the one time that we see hope is in Thetis's expectations. And so my question was, is there hope for people aside from those who are like Thetis, and that it kind of seems as though she's somewhat idealistic and even delusional, as she's aware of the realities of the world that her son is in. And so it's kind of making me wonder, do you have to sacrifice logic and your grip on reality in order to have hope, or can you have both?
What do you make of the cried out in dismay? I mean, does that dismay just that her delusional, expectations, delusional or otherwise, were countermanded or frustrated, or is she doing what we should do before an image like this? Should we cry out in dismay? I mean, clearly, it doesn't please her. I wonder if she really, maybe we'll set aside the question of whether this would please Achilles, but what exactly is the character of this dismay that she has?
I think that the dismay here, how I read it, was less because of how horrible these images were, and more because the continuation in the line immediately following it is that she cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son. And so whether or not this particular shield of Auden would please Achilles, the fact is still there that this is what Hephaestus thought would please Achilles. This is the estimation that Hephaestus has made of her son.
I think there's a way in which it kind of, you're exactly right in that it's very much not a response to any of the earlier like samples, which as heartbreaking as they may be, like intellectually. But I do think it's interesting that it's kind of the end note is the most personal of it's like, it's, Achilles' mother, like seeing and kind of foreseeing the almost obvious and like mourning it, because part of it, I think almost all the other instances of tragedy are like communicated in a very non-judgmental way. And it's apparent that the audience, it's, oh, this little boy, he just takes it for granted that this world is this way, or, oh, look, these like statistics clearly identify the need for kind of this mass tragedy, stuff like that. It's kind of showing the acceptance, but at the end of the day, it's still like there is someone somewhere who is going to be mourning and grieving over every one of these instances. I think the fact that it's Thetis and Achilles who are kind of the stand-ins for that is interesting, because that may be the most dramatic example of, like, obviously Thetis's love for Achilles is like very pronounced throughout the Iliad, but like if there was someone who came into the world and you had some reasonable expectation of them dying a violent death, like that was kind of baked in from the get-go in a way that like a lot of this other violence seems less inevitable almost when compared to, the course of Achilles' life and what he stands in for. But the fact that even Achilles' mother is the one who's mourning, and that's kind of the final bow on the poem, is like, look at all of this like unmeasurable, uncritiqued violence and suffering. But then here, even with Achilles, the iron-hearted Achilles, here's Thetis and here's how she reacts. And you can kind of retroactively look back and identify who are the Thetises in every one of these stanzas.
In both cases, there is something a little futile about Thetis going and asking Hephaestus to make this armor, right? Like, she knows that Achilles is fated to die. This shield eventually, I mean, it doesn't end up actually protecting him, and it itself is eventually lost. It does seem like there is Homer is creating a world around Achilles, right? Or at least he's revealing a world using Achilles, using the rage of Achilles to depict the world in the Iliad. And it does seem like, in a way, that's what Hephaestus is doing too with the shield, that he is using it as an occasion to craft an image of the world. And it seems like if we take that view of the maker, right, the poet, in Auden's case, he's also using Achilles, right, to craft an image of the world. And I still wonder if that's maybe where the hope lies, that just like there can be, I don't want to say that Homer, like a god, is creating the Greek world. It might be simply that he is using his poetic skill to bring out what the world is, using Achilles as the occasion for that. And I wonder if Auden is suggesting that, as we were talking about at the very beginning, the mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and all that weighs the same, if somehow we can, there's hope because Achilles still exists, that we can still use Achilles as an occasion to try to bring out the truth about the world, however grim it might be. That we can find our way to wholeness again, even if we do have to reconcile ourselves to the apparent lack of wholeness that the poem depicts.
Would you go even farther, Chris, and say we can find our way to wholeness, but through art, through poetry, through making anew?
That could be. And yeah, it does seem like, though, it depends what art is, right? Are you making something completely new, like a god would, or are you, as a poet, simply revealing something about the world that's already there?
I think the here, right, it's a clear case of Auden using something, mm-hmm. referring to something that has already happened, and drawing on the rich vein that is Achilles, and is the Trojan War and is the Iliad. And even Hephaestus, right? He makes the shield, and it's sort of wondrous, but it's of human beings. It's not like he's created something that is depicting even something that has never been done before.
Well, I mean, it seems like one way of thinking about wholeness and in terms of the shield is letting us know what the boundary is, or the limit of the thing. In order, I mean, to know what a thing is, you kind of have to know what its end is, right? In maybe both senses. And I wonder if that's what Auden is able to accomplish here by thinking of modern warfare in terms of the shield of Achilles, showing us the limit. So, and the limit might be the kind of unlimited nature of this, everything about this seems to be unintelligible. There's the unintelligible multitude, and so the if my hypothesis is right, that it has something, that the problem here has something to do with thinking that we can achieve justice through statistics, right, through the scientific application of science to warfare and maybe to society itself. Maybe that's the limit, the thing that allows our vision to be narrow, because that's the other thing that struck me about this poem, comparing the world that Auden depicts to Thetis's expectation, but also to the shield of Achilles in the Iliad, is how narrow this world is. You have a sky like lead instead of the constellations and the whole description of the heavens, etc. There are no gods here. There's no beauty. There's really only kind of and no color, right? Nothing is golden either. Everything is gray. So it might be he might be showing us the limited nature of the of the lack of limits, of the idea that everything is malleable and therefore unintelligible in this world of statistics.
Well, I also think it is interesting. One of maybe the most direct link between these two kind of competing visions is when it's like Thetis is looking at where she expects to see like this sacrificial altar and like this scene, and instead saw, not that, but the like barbed wire enclosed spot. So I do think it may be the like unintelligibleness and artlessness of this like violent world is still meant to be like very much the world of Thetis, and there is crossover, but it's almost changed by the use or the constraints kind of imposed by, barbed wire is probably actually a great metaphor.
Yeah. Do you have a thought about that? Why this scene of a prison camp would be what replaces the altar, or why Thetis would look at this image expecting to see an altar, but instead seeing this barbed wire enclosing an arbitrary spot. Arbitrary again, right? So there's no particular reason for choosing this spot versus another. Could be anything. But yeah, why is that what replaces the sacred? A concentration camp somehow replaces what is sacred.
Well, I do think there's something very profound about that. Of like, I don't know if any of you have read Storm of Swords, or Storm of Steel. Got confused with George R. R. Martin. But it's Ernst Jünger's book about the First World War, and there's this brilliant opening line, or opening, the like 1929 English translation he wrote himself. And he was a German author who had just, finished fighting the First World War. And the preface is orienting his British audience, who he thinks of as being like the soldiers in the British Army who were in the trenches, presumably opposite of him. And he tries to draw them into where geographically he was on the front lines in 1914, to like make sure that if a British reader was, opposite of him, they wouldn't have seen him or known he was there, but that they would know, like, if you're by this barn, by this like broken tree, and there was the trench cat and like all these little geographic distinguishers, so that you could know if you were within the 100 people or whatever opposite him, that like, oh, like, hey, like, I had a lot of respect for you, by the way. But the whole like geographic locating it just shows all the little like happenstance of how these like, it's almost a little bit like when Hector's circling Troy, how all these peaceful places have been repurposed so radically. And it feels like happenstance, but also you could say, like, I feel like the description's almost alluding to it being a church. Like, that was probably a pretty big, centrally located building. Like, if you needed to pick a place to hold prisoners of war, like, it's not that bad. I mean, Independence Hall in Philadelphia was, I think, like a prisoner of war holding area for a while. Like, you need a big building, and that's kind of the relevant constraint, not whatever artful purpose it actually held before. So I do think it captures a little bit of that like transformative nature, and how literally, like, especially, World War I metaphors tend to emphasize it a lot, but just how like physically transformative of the geography war can be.
Is the fact that we have this ordinary, decent folk assembling and watching, is there something, I mean, that does seem like it smacks of ritual in itself, but what it gets, if not then pieties, libation, and sacrifice, what is that? What are they observing? What are they ritualistically observing that takes the place of a white flower garland and heifers? I need to read this book, Jacob. Thanks. I need one more book to read. But yeah, that kind of personal triangulation that Jünger does, it doesn't seem like it's possible here. Something has replaced it, but what exactly has replaced it?
There's also the fact that the officials are bored, the ones who are taking, who are, I guess, overseeing the execution, as though this is, not quite sure what to make of that. They crack it. One of them cracks a joke too, but that this sacrifice, in a way, of these three prisoners is just kind of a boring matter of routine. It's so you could say it's a ritual that people aren't even really, the crowd is watching it, but they're not really thinking very much about it. They're neither moving nor speaking. And I don't know, the three pale figures being put up against posts, it still seems like that might be an allusion to the crucifixion with the two thieves, right, along with Christ.
So I am a docent at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and for me, this particular stanza, um, I think, really reminded me of the Holocaust by bullets. Um, about 1.5 million Jews were killed prior to the Wannsee Conference, um, when German command units went out, and they did have a very ritualistic system over a period of 2 days in which they would essentially do exactly what's happening here. They would go into the towns and then they would round up the Jews. They would take them to a particular spot, it didn't matter where, and then they would execute them. And I think the saddest part about this episode of the Holocaust was the fact that often the neighbors would either assist the German units, or they would go and watch, and it would become some sort of town-wide spectacle. And so that's kind of what it reminds me of. And then in addition, seeing the particular choice of the three figures as maybe hearkening to the charge of deicide that encouraged a lot of this anti-Semitism.
I don't want to equate at all, but I'm now wondering about myself reading the Iliad. I'm watching in a way. I mean, I'm imagining it. I'm enjoying it, even this violence. I mean, I guess maybe this comes back to I can't seem to let go of this question about art, like the mediation of the poetry. Does that make it? Is that what gives me hope? Like I can read about war and incredibly gory, viscerally poignant deaths, and not have it do violence to my own soul in the way that I think obviously these the ordinary decent folk just hanging around watching executions, it seems very clear to me that they're doing violence to their own souls there. But it doesn't feel like I'm doing violence to my soul when I read either this poem or the Iliad.
It does seem like we're participating in the Iliad in a way when we read it, right? And I mean, hopefully we're not bored when reading the Iliad. Maybe some are. None of us, right? But it does seem like this is the that there is something boring about this a kind of murder en masse, right? It's a statistical kind of warfare. It's impersonal, as we've been talking about. And so, yeah, it does seem like it. It's got to be doing violence to the souls of these people insofar as they're separated from, they're not able to weep because another wept, right? Separated from the suffering of these individual people. I mean, related to that is the next stanza, which we haven't talked about this very much. The idea that these three figures lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. So somehow, just thinking about the violence done to one's soul, maybe in the context anyway of modern warfare, as opposed to one's soul being intact, maybe in the Iliad, the warfare is waged in the Iliad. How do these these three pale figures, how do they die as men before their bodies died? And I wonder, the they might refer to both the people being executed, but also the people watching, and maybe the officials too, who are just bored with the whole thing. Is there a way in which all of these people have died as men before their bodies died?
I think that a loss of apathy, and I think that just having your pride stripped away, either having it being taken away by others, or I think that you lose the ability to have any true pride whenever you do harm like this to others. I think that is in a way a death. And that's why a lot of people refer to, horrendous crimes against humanity as a double death, because even before your body dies, you've already killed their soul.
There's also kind of on the note of Francis's point, and then also yesterday, I think was Yom HaShoah, which is the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel. There was, I think it was Primo Levi, who wrote about how like washing in the concentration camps didn't really serve actually much hygienic value, like to have 60 sickly people sharing like one bucket of water to like wash their hands or wash themselves doesn't actually do much to combat like the spread of disease. But it was a very important way to kind of establish your continued humanity, and these rituals of like cleaning yourself and like caring about personal hygiene, even when stripped of the actual like medicinal or ritual or religious value, what have you, but just in like establishing your humanity. And then obviously for him, that was the case. But I think, if you think about many people in camps, or, you can include like many other atrocities, like, many prisoner of war camps and stuff like that would often actually see the like total devolution stripping, like that double death you're speaking of. But so I do think they might be perhaps analogous to that. But it can be outside of the like relationship to war, but perhaps the consequences, like we discussed the kind of mass and majesty. One element I do think is it could be mass as an allusion to masses rather than individual, like the distinction of society of like the majesty, more aristocratic or elites or whatever. Like there are some people making decisions and some people facing the consequences of those decisions to a degree.
Yeah, I really like that, Jacob, because that's helping me make sense of this. I've been thinking about this possibility that Chris raised, that maybe the they is not just the three prisoners, but everybody involved. And right before the they are introduced in that third line of the sixth stanza, this mass and majesty of the world lay in the hands of others. And it does seem like maybe that sort of abdication of responsibility, like the subjection that the prisoners are under, but then it turns out they're under these officials, these board officials in the centuries who are just they are following orders. Right. They've given up their ability to make their own decisions about what it is it's been proved by statistics that some cause was just. And I wonder if that's a death too, not on the side of the people who, not only on the side of the people who are treated without dignity in this way and been treated in such an atrocious manner, but then also what they've done to themselves. I think in a way they don't get to call themselves They don't get to call themselves men anymore. They don't get to call themselves human beings if they're going to give up this capacity to make their own decisions about life and death, about what's worth living and dying for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it right. So it seems like maybe the voice that appears out of the air without a face, that's the other, or the others in whose hands the world lies. But right, the officials are bored, so it seems like they're not necessarily ideologues exactly. They're not zealous. They're not zealously murdering these people. They are, just following orders. We as one says, or as Eichmann, right, in Jerusalem might say. And so, this reminds me again of an argument that Arendt makes about totalitarianism, that the ideal citizen of a totalitarian state isn't the true believer. It's someone who has no convictions at all anymore, and so is perfectly malleable depending on the circumstance. And that isn't really a human being anymore. It's someone who isn't, it doesn't think of himself as responsible for what he's doing or for actually making decisions, simply a kind of cog in this giant machine. And a machine that doesn't really seem to be controlled by anyone. It's always someone else. It's always an other.
Yeah, I think of the intro scene before Thetis comes to ask for the shield. There are these automata that Hephaestus has forged that are they just go around, do their business. They're made out of gold and silver. And I wonder, that's a stretch, but I wonder about this. He's the god of technical arts. He's the god of making things, of machinery. I have to wonder if this was, this is what he sees down his path too. And now I'm completely reinterpreting this last line. The strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles who would not live long. What Hephaestus sets in motion. And now I'm depersonalizing it. I'm impersonalizing this move towards technology and machinery and away from the personal. Yeah, Achilles can't live in that world. There can't be that hero, which I hope everyone who hears me say the word hero doesn't think of firemen or whatever, but the Greek sense of the single combatant who is going out and making a name for himself, acquiring glory. That seems like that's not long for the world that Hephaestus builds.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, that there's a tension between the kind of technical mastery of the world, especially the where that leads, which is the technical mastery of society, and a real kind of human being, right? a hero in that sense.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking about this poem with me. I definitely got some new insights into this poem by one of my favorite poets about one of my favorite poems. It's just a lot of poetry layered onto each other, and I always appreciate that. But thank you so much for having this difficult, sad, but beautiful conversation. And I really appreciate Frances, Jacob, and of course, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us.